And thank you much for you coming here. I'm happy to see that it's a popular topic, meditation and psychedelics. I also have been approached by several people that pointing out that I'm of the very few, if not the only one, that is not a scientist that speaks here. So my training is not at all scientific, and also I want to, of course, I also will give you some information during the next half hour, but the emphasis is maybe not so much on putting much information to you, but rather that we try to have a good time together. Half an hour of spending together, and we are in crowded camps here, but so, please relax as good as you can. I will not speak so quickly, and you don't have to remember anything. So more towards feeling, maybe more towards appreciating our experience rather than to describe it, analyze it, and explain it. So, every now and then, Thich Nhat Hanh has the mindfulness spell, just take a breath and feel yourself. Science is a method, is a wonderful method, just as meditation is a method, a wonderful method, and psychedelics are a method. But really, ultimately, it doesn't, the whole thing is bigger, or basically we don't know. Basically, we have no idea what the hell we are doing here. We have many information, and we are very clever, and we are, in some ways, sometimes by assuming a lot of knowledge, we try to get away from the not so comfortable fact that we don't know what we are doing here. Sometimes I think like it's, if you have a play of Shakespeare, and then you can go and you analyze the stage, and you analyze the clothing that the actors have on, and you can measure the weight of them, and but there's something else going on in a Shakespeare play than the technical details. So that's true for our life. As I said yesterday in the round table, or the panel discussion, I'm an old hippie, and I was on a career. I was studying at the University of Zürich, and I already had a successful little business, and then I took some LSD. And that totally threw me out of my worldview. I was really, and it was both in some ways very freeing, but also very confusing. And in one of the very first or the second actually LSD session, I experienced myself as a Buddha sitting in full lotus. I couldn't sit in full lotus, of course, and I had no idea what a Buddha was, but I had the distinct feeling that was my experience. But in some ways that still reverberates to the day. It totally changed my life. And in that respect, I'm a good example of a whole generation. So it played in my personal life an important role, but a whole generation, not dozens, hundreds of thousands of people were in very similar, had this very similar experience. And Tricycle is the biggest Buddhist English magazine. They made a survey of today, it's 15 years ago now, of practicing Buddhists, and 83% said that they had had a psychedelic experience prior to their Buddhist practice. 83%, that's not exactly... and interesting then, for like the 80s and 90s, In some ways, we thought we were in the meditation centers sort of becoming a dinosaur and an endangered species. The young people weren't really so interested in meditation. But then later on, the last 10 or 15 years, psychedelics became more popular again, and lo and behold, young people show up at the meditation centers. Nowadays, we have quite a few regularly, between 20 and 30-year-old people being willing to put themselves right into the practice, getting up early in the morning, doing silent meditation and all that. And then, of course, we will also have a short look then in the even bigger picture, where psychedelic and meditation and spirituality in a very long term have played a very close have a very close relationship. Like in the Rig Vedas, the oldest part of the Vedas, which are some of the oldest religious writing in the world, they mention that soma 126 times. The soma is mentioned, and that's obviously a strong psychedelic concoction that they took when they wanted to talk to the gods, or in the Greek mystery plays, they had the kykeon that they drank. That obviously also was, we don't know exactly what it was, but quite obviously also a strong psychedelic concoction. So meditation and psychedelic is our topic today, and one way one can approach it is looking at the etymology of the words. Meditation comes from the Latin word meditari, and that again is the root of med, M-E-D, is from the Indo-Germanic meaning to walk, to measure, to stake out. You could say that meditating in that sense is exploring the sphere of consciousness, putting markers and walking and measuring out consciousness. Whereas psychedelic is from Greek, from the psyche, which is the breath or seed of consciousness, and delos is clear or visible. So we could say psychedelics maybe could say clear our mind to make the nature of consciousness more visible. So they point in a very similar direction. Another point where they meet is, and that I learned only through my contact with the scientists and neurologists, that they assure me that they cannot, in the imaging, the brain imaging, they cannot distinguish a brain under psilocybin and a brain in meditation at certain stages of the trip. It's basically undistinguishable. That's sort of interesting, and they can also show that in other extreme situations like high fever or like fatigue. If you basically the classical tapas, the classical austerities produce obviously similar patterns and produce similar effects from the inside. In some ways, that's the scientific proof of Patanjali. He is the author of the Yoga Sutras. Maybe not a historical figure, but lived before Buddha even. And he says in the first surah about the truth, he says the siddhis, the wonderful states or states or capacities, they occur spontaneous. Obviously, some people have spontaneous, strong experience of something. Or the second is already medicinal plants, psychedelics. And then it comes the tapas, the fasting, and the mantras, the repeating of a word. And only at the end actually comes meditation. And so that kind of these technologies of consciousness have been very well known as long as humans exist. But this is sort of the scientific proof of what he claims there. The other thing that obviously combines the two things is that they feel very similar. From the inside, they feel very similar. And I wanted to read to you because it is from Houston Smith. Houston Smith, he died now, was one of the world leading scientists on religion. And he got into psychedelics a little bit, and he was a professor, and he confronted his students with two short reports of a enlightenment experience, of a deep mystical experience, and he asked his students which one was spontaneous and which one was produced by a psychedelic, induced. And to give you a feeling of most of you probably are aware of it, but maybe some are not, of the intensity of these kind of experiences, of the power of life-changing power of these experiences. I will read to you just the two short paragraphs. One is spontaneous and one is psychedelic induced. And twice as many students, 46, answered incorrectly, and only 1/3 answered correctly in guessing which is which. So I read. Suddenly I burst into a vast, new, indescribably wonderful universe. Although I'm writing this over a year later, the thrill of the surprise and amazement, the awesomeness of the revelation, the engulfment in an overwhelming feeling wave of gratitude and blessed wonderment are as fresh, and the memory of the experience as vivid as if it had happened 5 minutes ago. And yet, to concoct anything by way of description that would even hint at the magnitude, the sense of ultimate reality, this seems such an impossible task. The knowledge which has infused and affected every aspect of my life came instantaneously and with such complete force of certainty that it was impossible, then or since, to doubt its validity. So that's one description. And the next one, all at once, without warning of any kind, I found myself wrapped in a flame-colored cloud. For an instant, I thought of fire. The next, I knew that fire was within myself. Directly afterwards, there came upon me a sense of exaltation, of immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination impossible to describe. Among other things, I did not merely come to believe, but I saw that the universe is not composed of dead matter, but it is, on the contrary, a living presence. I became conscious in myself of eternal life. I saw that all men are immortal, that the cosmic order is such that without any peradventure all things work together for the good of each and all, that the foundation principle of the world is what we call love, and that the happiness of each and all is in the long run absolutely certain. So these are two descriptions of an experience that is obviously very similar and was caused by very different, as young hippies we used to say, the Enlightenment doesn't care how you came here. Yeah. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the study that we did. Inspired, I got by I was totally abstinent for over 25 years, nothing at all. And then I knew I had to go back and look into what so severely influenced my life, to the better, I felt. And I knew I had to go and look into it. And so one of the places I did that was in a peyote ceremony for the Native American church. And I was struck by the by the ritual, it reminded me strong of a Zen Sesshin. You cannot just get up and get out. I mean, you can, but you're not supposed to. And if you go out, there's a certain time, and there's a certain way you go out. You don't go in front, or you go behind. And this very much reminded me of a Zen Sesshin. Of course, if you're not familiar with a Zen Sesshin, that would be totally crazy to put on top. I mean, you would feel like, what is going on? But if that's really your second nature, and you feel totally comfortable with these forms, as the Indians did with their form, this is a container that has evolved over centuries to hold that kind of deep experience. In the Sesshin, people sometimes have that kind of breakthrough. And this is a container that helps you to somehow stabilize you and make it more likely that you can bring this kind of intensive experience into your everyday life, which is really the point. I mean, and if you have a nice deep experience, that's wonderful, but if that's it, and it doesn't really reach your life, it is ultimately not so meaningful. It has to really, it has to change your life. You have to ultimately become a more happy, a more compassionate, a more open person. So I approached Franz Vollenweider, who is an old buddy and professor at the University of Zürich, and he has for over 20 years back then had and I said, do you think it's possible again? So he has good connections, and he talked to the president of the ethics committee, and so it took several years, but we did manage to do it. And so we held a regular 5-day session, and on the 4th day, half of the people got placebo, and half of them got psilocybin. They got into the MRI before and afterwards, and had a lot of questionnaires to fill out, and so forth. Now, in Buddhism, we have these 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And in this psychedelic world, we also have 3 jewels, as we know, substance, set, and setting. And one interesting, a very similar study has been done in the John Hopkins University with Roland Griffiths and his team, and they also used psilocybin, and they used similar dose. They used dose-related different dosages, and we were sort of in the lower of the 2 high dosages, let's say. And they had about 2/3 of the people reported mystical experiences in those higher doses, but about 1/3 of them also reported more or less strong fear or confusion states. Whereas in our study, none of those, almost unscientifically, not a single one reported any kind of more serious confusion or fear state. Now, what is the difference? I ask myself. Plus, in our case, but I think what they consider a full-blown mystical experience is not really a full-blown mystical experience, I would say. In our case, it was 95%, except for one person, all reported, and I would say that's not the case. But that's just where we just did it the same that all other studies did it. I think you have to reach 60% of the criterions, and then it's considered a full-blown. But still, it goes up there where people say it's among the most important experiences that they had in their life, or among the most 3 or 5 most important. So the substance was the same, the sacrament was the same, the medicine was the same. We had synthetic psilocybin. Now the set already was different, of course, because in our case, these were people who have a long, solid meditation practice. In many cases, at least, I think none of them were less than like 3 years, but a lot of them had 10, 20, or 30 years of meditation practice. And ideally, no experience with psychedelics. Well, we couldn't find quite 40 people that were that long meditated and willing to try it. So there are, of course, people who... So about half of them really had no experience, which were the most interesting, and the other one as little as possible. At some points we had to not look too closely. So that is a difference, but I think it certainly makes a difference. And the other main difference is that we were in a temple outside in the countryside, very beautifully, no cars, you have to walk there. And we did, 3 days of silent meditation before that sort of focuses you. And that's a very different vibe, very different feeling than a hospital room on the 4th floor, even though it may be nicely decorated and everything, but still it's a totally different vibration. And so I think that points clearly into the direction that we will have to go in further 5 minutes. Yeah. Maybe one of the things that people ask me often, especially from the Buddhist community, of course, is say, isn't that illegal in Buddhist tradition? We have the silas, where you don't steal, and you don't lie, and you don't kill, and you don't intoxicate body or mind. But then I also say, we also have the 4 things that a monk is allowed to have, and that is clothing, and the bowl to bake food, and shelter to sleep under, and explicitly medicine. You're allowed to have medicine. Well, I like it. Medicine for the body, and I think we are talking about medicine, that these things are, they're not intoxicating. Some of these substances you can probably also, you can basically misuse anything. If you drink too much water, you probably can kill yourself. But used appropriately and wisely, I think these substances, these holy substances, as Albert Hoffmann, I had the good fortune to spend a whole day with him a few weeks before he passed on, and he sort of laid his hand and looked at me and said, these holy substances belong into the hands of meditation. I think I'm aware of that. We have to, for those who express that, this is a political, what should I say, the art of politics is to make what is possible. So I think to narrow it down to a scientific point of view is practically what we have to do at this point. This is what our society can hear and understand, and politicians can hear. But certainly the experience is way beyond that. And we are dealing with a bigger universe than only the medical application or the important as they are. Maybe that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your contribution. Are there questions?
Yeah. What were like the main findings, what the people reported?
Well, the scientific findings should be published within a few weeks, actually.
All right.
Yeah, has taken a while, and it goes with the ego dissolution. For me personally, the main thing is that we could even do it. That was the main success. But also, I really wanted to ask my colleagues who are long-term meditators, is that helpful to you? You have been sitting for 30 years and you have not try this one. So, and none, again, very unscientifically, all of them said it's very helpful. All of them. Not a single one had a negative, to various degrees, to totally enthusiastic, to, yes, interesting, had similar experiences on meditation and so forth.
Will it be published in Price?
In Nature.
Whoa! Good work. I'm glad.
But then anything in that magazine, in this magazine, coming up about this?
Well, to me it was already interesting to see that, the placebo people, the brain, our instruments are so finely tuned, the brain looks totally different after a week of sitting for the placebo people. Amazing. Of course, it must be so because you feel different. After a week of sitting in silence, you are in a different state of mind, and you can show that. But those who had the active, there was much, much more so. So they just go deeper and more and without the assistance.
Are you planning to do more experiments in that?
Yes.
Are you looking for more people?
Yes.
Anybody?
What classifies an experienced meditator, which maybe goes along the question, but is it people that have been in silent retreats before or that have like 30 years of experience, or how do you choose who's experienced and who isn't really?
Yeah. So how did we select them?
Yeah.
I think about 1,000 hours of meditation was the minimum, and that you had partaken in like several days of silent retreat in some way. It could be vipassana, it could be Zen or like that. Most people were Zen people, partly because a lot of them came out of the network that we had. Especially those who had never taken psilocybin, they basically took it or came on a personal relationship, that they trusted my invitation.
This was really wonderful, thank you. At the retreat center that I work, we sometimes get long-term Buddhist meditators in as well. And they sometimes belong to a class that has extremely atypical responses to psychedelics. And we're talking high doses of truffles. If you would equate it, they received, one person even up to 60 milligrams of psilocybin with no alterations of consciousness. Now, at first we were, this is atypical and this might relate to this person, but we had ongoing conversations and even read some research that seemed to suggest that long-term meditators might have very different experiences when sitting with substance. And I was wondering if you could comment on this, if you've seen similar things, or if you've seen some things in these studies.
Well, the classic, of course, some of you may, Ram Dass in his yellow book.
Yeah.
That's a classic example. He gives them high doses. Trungpa Rinpoche did the same thing. I know somebody who was there when he actually took it, and then conducted business as usual. I don't know. I'm not in that category. I don't know. I guess if you are really centered on ultimate being, maybe it doesn't disturb you anymore. Or it doesn't. I can't really say. I was surprised to read the other day Ramana Maharshi, the great Indian saint. Obviously, in that group too, some people took substances, and I was very surprised.
So, the last question.
First of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was really inspiring and different from all the others that we heard. I was wondering, what do you think if psychedelics influence the meditation practice, or if meditation practice is actually influencing the psychedelic experience?
I think it's a codependent arising. I think these two things go together, and I think they have historically really developed together. So it's like, what's the egg or the chicken is first, but I think they, and if people, if there are some, especially Asian teachers are very strict, substances is a no-no, and it doesn't go with meditation, well, I tell them that certainly meditation goes very well with substances. It seems like a really good preparation for this kind of very strong experiences, to have learned to sit quietly in the midst of it and not have to react immediately, and have some stamina to actually hold that. It really seems to help if you have some kind of practice in that way.
Thanks.